In this video, I focus on the most critical writing mechanics. In some instances, punctuation clarifies meaning, but in most cases, punctuation signals good or bad etiquette. Ultimately, to be recognized by an audience as a professional requires that writers follow rules of etiquette when using punctuation. The good news is that research demonstrates that not all mechanical or even all punctuation problems get the same level of negative attention, especially from workplace readers of English. Business people in the U.S. form highly negative opinions based on sentence boundaries. I'll focus on those aspects of punctuation in this video. When we speak, we signal boundaries with intonation and pauses. Often those appear between units we wouldn't punctuate in writing. And when our audience misinterprets our meaning because they misperceive boundaries, they can simply ask for clarification. When we write, however, we signal boundaries only with visual symbols, like punctuation. And there's no chance for the audience to signal they've misunderstood and then get us to clarify. Recognizing sentence boundaries is at the root of the most serious punctuation problems. That means sentence fragments, comma splices, and run-ons. Instead of repeating definitions of grammatical categories that have probably been of little help to you up to this point, I'm going to give you an operational definition. You've probably not encountered this before. This test has helped countless writers who do not intuitively recognize sentence boundaries in English. We'll be considering punctuation examples from a letter of application from a finance student in a master's level degree program to the manager at a tech company. Before we go further, we should get clear about the context of that message. As with any letter of application, the primary purpose was to direct the reader. In particular, these letters seek to get the reader to contact the writer and set up a meeting or interview. The audience for this cover letter is a specific individual that two former interns told the writer about. The reader will be an expert on business intelligence, but ignorant of any specifics about the writer. The reader will probably be slightly skeptical of or sensitive to the writer's claims, and that means the writer has to develop informative and persuasive content to increase the reader's readiness to accept the message. The manager is likely to process information both centrally and peripherally. Last but not least, we need to consider the writer-reader relationship. It's challenging to predict much. The reader probably has more power in this situation, but that would depend on their level of need for additional employees and business intelligence. The more demand or vacancies, the more power the writer has. I already noted that the reader and writer don't know each other, but they do have connections in common. As usual in our review of the context of messages, we can't sufficiently predict value differences, but the writer certainly needs to be able to do this. Now let's start talking about recognizing sentence boundaries. Consider the example shown here. The writer has punctuated this passage with 2 periods, creates 2 word strings that we would probably call sentences. Let's look at this first operational test for identifying sentence boundaries. In English, any declarative sentence, you might have called this an independent clause in the past, it can be transformed into a question by simply inverting the subject and first verb. Our string has been transformed, in what I'm showing here, into a yes-no question by inverting I and have. I have becomes have I. Notice that sounds like a perfectly normal sentence in English. The second string, however, is a problem. What verb in that string would you invert and place first? English uses a form of the verb do when there's only a main verb. But there's nothing to do without a verb. Plus, where's the noun that serves as a subject? The second string can't be made into a yes-no question. Although it's punctuated as a sentence, it isn't one because it's missing key grammatical items that are required in an English sentence, a subject and a verb. Let's apply the second operational test with the same string to see if we get the same results. declarative English sentences can also be transformed into something called tag questions. The first string from our example shows how this works. The auxiliary verb have is added with a negative marker and a pronoun that refers back to the subject of the original word string. In this case, that's I. So I have, and then in the tag, haven't I. This counts as an acceptable English question, right? Our second string is a problem again. We can't add a tag ending. The missing subject means we can't determine what pronoun should be added in the tag, and we can't decide which form of do should be added. Would it be don't I? Doesn't it? We just don't know. Both of our operational tests, the question test and the tag ending test, indicate that string 1 qualifies to be punctuated as a sentence with a period, but string 2 does not. It's not technically a sentence at all. Because it was punctuated as one, but is incomplete, it's called a sentence fragment. Now that we have a way of recognizing sentence boundaries, we'll fix the punctuation problem on the next slide. Sentence fragments are created when a writer uses a period to mark a boundary that doesn't technically constitute a sentence, or if you prefer, an independent clause. One way to fix the problem is to incorporate the fragment into the preceding sentence. That's what I've done here. Another way to fix the fragment would be to expand it by supplying the missing subject and verb. With either fix, the writer avoids the negative attention earned from business readers who encounter a sentence fragment. While most professionals would ignore sentence fragments in informal contexts, like, for example, in chat, research shows that those same readers make negative attributions about the writer of a document based on fragments in a report, or an application letter, or even an email. The second serious or critical punctuation problem I'm going to teach you to fix is called the comma splice. This problem is created when a writer uses a comma instead of a period to mark a sentence boundary. This string I'm showing you from the application letter has a comma splice. Let's try the tag ending operational test to see if it helps us identify sentence boundaries. I'm showing two versions of tag endings for the original string because I can't tell which one is right. It could be hasn't she or he to refer back to the store manager, or it could be don't I to refer back to the writer's preference. The fact that we have two equally valid choices means we've got two sentences in this string. Of course, one way to fix the problem here is to signal the end of the first sentence before however. An alternative revision would be to signal the end of the first sentence or independent clause with semicolon. This is the only other punctuation mark appropriate for signaling a sentence boundary. Many writers create comma splices when using the conjunctive adverb, however. Conjunctive adverbs can appear within a single sentence or between two sentences. The operational tests allow you to diagnose which it is. So now I want to talk about an issue that's similar to a comma splice, but probably less common. It's created when a writer uses no punctuation between sentences or independent clauses. In that case, you're dealing with something called a run-on sentence rather than a comma splice. That's the case with the first string shown here. The revision fixes the issue by adding a period to mark the boundary. You might also use a semicolon here. If you choose a colon, it wouldn't be technically correct because what follows the colon and what precedes it is a complete sentence. Most readers won't notice, like they will with a comma or no punctuation at all. The final punctuation issue I want to talk about is critical, may surprise you. It has to do with using question marks. Let me show you an example of a string that uses something other than a question mark. The revision fixes this issue by replacing the period. Research shows that many readers notice when the wrong punctuation is used to signal a sentence boundary for a question. This is obviously a simple fix, But writers have to believe it's important enough to do, and they have to be able to locate the issue before sending their message to readers. You'll have the opportunity to explore tools for identifying errors with punctuation in some of our activities. But tools are not always correct. Only knowledgeable writers can judge whether the tool is right or not. What we know is that writers do need to follow some rules of etiquette with punctuation. Showing your understanding of etiquette is similar to the way you greet people or use silverware when eating. When you don't demonstrate that etiquette, others often attribute negative qualities to you. Managing those attributions is important to your career. Punctuating sentence boundaries is the most critical type of etiquette for workplace writers. I taught you some tests for identifying those boundaries to solve issues caused by sentence fragments, comma splices, and run-ons. By all means, learn more about punctuation if it matters to you. But signaling sentence boundaries is the bare minimum for professionals who write in English.